Good afternoon, everyone. Thank you. I think we're almost ready. We got a few folks signing in. In the meantime, I'll let you know who I am. My name's Ben Bryce. I'm an advisor to the director of the Department of Water Resources. I'll sort of be guiding us all through this today. We really appreciate you all being here. We know that 4 o'clock on a Wednesday, you all have other things you could be doing. This kind of stuff can be tricky. So we're glad you're here. Oh, I'm sorry. Can everybody hear me? If you can't, let me know. Okay. Turn it up. It's my fault. I'm sorry. Love it. Oh, almost. Are we there? Right. Okay. Thank you all. Appreciate your indulgence. I'll start over. My name is Ben Bryce. The role that I play at the department is to serve, thank you, as an advisor to the director, Mr. Tom Bushatsky. He's the director of the Department of Water Resources. Our department is the one that regulates the quantity of groundwater and surface water. If you have questions about water quality, that's a different department. But what we do is water quantity. We're here to talk about the Ranegras Plain Basin, walk through what's going on in the basin, the state of groundwater there. I'm sure that most of you, if not all of you, are going to have lots of questions. So we're here to answer those questions if we can. We're also going to be providing resources to help with that. And because we know these things are complicated, because we know that some questions will come after the fact, we expect that there will be an ongoing conversation here to make sure that everyone's able to understand the situation. So know that if today you've got questions, we're here to answer them. We can be pretty informal. You seem like a fun bunch. Or, we'll see. Or I love that. Thank you. I appreciate that. I'm a little nervous, so that'll be great. Or if down the line there's additional questions, we can be available to you too. I get phone calls and emails all the time about every question under the sun, and I answer most of them. So that's what we'll be here to do. But before we start, I do want to recognize that your Chief Deputy Assessor, Carrie Ann Noltner, is here with us. I missed where you sat down there. There we are. And also, who is not here with us in person, but in spirit, Supervisor Holly Irwin is on the line. I'd like to turn the time over to her to give just a brief introduction to what we're doing today, seeing as how she did set this up for us to make sure we could get out here. So appreciative to her. Let me know, Dennis, whenever that's ready. All right.
Are you guys ready? Can you hear me?
We can. Thank you.
Okay, sorry, for some reason I can't get my video working either, but good afternoon. My name is Holly Irwin with La Paz County Board of Supervisors representing District 3. I would like to thank everyone who could attend this meeting here today, either in person or virtually. My apologies that I cannot be there today for this very important meeting. I'm dealing with some family issues. I would also like to thank the Arizona Department of Water Resources and staff for giving me the opportunity to open this meeting and for them to provide all of you with important information regarding Ranegras Plain Basin and what active management areas are. Over the past 9 years, I've dedicated myself and I've been working with our state representatives on groundwater reform, specifically to alternatives to the state-only option of an AMA or INA for groundwater protection with no success due to the breakdown at the legislature. Water should be a priority and a bipartisan issue, but unfortunately it is not. Significant progress has been made over the past 2 legislative sessions. However, we're not there just yet. This has been a most challenging issue for me during my 16 years representing La Paz County and desperately wanting groundwater protection for the people that I represent without hindering the county's ability to grow and managing our groundwater responsibly for our future. Groundwater issues in La Paz County and across the state have finally reached a point where protection has become a priority. Governor Katie Hobbs, who has visited La Paz County back in June and formed the Governor's Water Policy Council back in 2023 through executive order, recognizes how critical water concerns in our state has become, which is why we are all here today. On behalf of La Paz County Board of Supervisors, I would like to thank you all again for being here today. Thank you.
Thank you, Supervisor Irwin. So just a few introductions before we get started. Here with me are a number of different DWR staff. And when I say DWR, I'm referring to the Department of Water Resources. Emily Petrick, who is one of our attorneys. And then we have our Assistant Director, Carol Ward. Excuse me, I told Carol I was going to forget. Carol Ward, who is much smarter and more capable than I am. We also have our newly minted Director of AMA Establishments, Olga Hart. Then we have our Chief Hydrologist. I'm so sorry, Ryan Mitchell. See, I jinxed myself, and I wish I hadn't. We also have Dennis Troutman and Brennan Thalman, who will be taking care of this meeting for us. And then Doug McCackern over here, who will be taking care of all media issues and press issues, if there are any media or press here with us today. The agenda for today's meeting. First, we'll walk through our meeting logistics, etc., and then we'll talk about the hydrology of the Ranegras Plain. And by that, we're talking about the water under the ground, essentially. And smarter people than me will walk through what that is. We'll also talk about water management options. The shorthand version of what happens in Arizona is that unless you have a certain type of regulatory regime, an active management area, or an irrigation non-expansion area, groundwater is essentially unregulated in Arizona. And we'll talk about those different options and how they change that paradigm. And then we'll move to a question and answer phase, which I think will be of most interest to most of you. And then we'll close our meeting. This is not a formal public hearing. So we do want to keep this, well behaved, etc., but it's not overly formal. We are, however, recording it. And when we record something, it becomes a public record. What that means is anyone can access it. So before you say or do anything, just know we are recording it. It will be preserved for posterity and whoever else might want it. We would ask that you hold questions until the end. If you can't hear something or you just really didn't understand what was just said, certainly we can answer clarifying questions in the moment. But if we have substantive questions or discussion, we'd ask that you hold that until the end. And that, of course, we all be respectful of each other. What we cannot do, or I should say first, I'll be passing around a microphone to make sure that we can all hear any questions that you may have. Try and keep your phone muted during the proceeding. It'll make it easier for everyone, especially with the recording going on. If you have specific questions about your specific situation, this probably isn't going to be a very good forum for that. If you want to know how you specifically are impacted, if you have a question about your specific situation, we're not going to be able to answer that for you. That's a better question for the department one-on-one later, or to consult an attorney. So with that, I'll turn it over to Ryan Mitchell, who will walk through the hydrology of the basin.
Thank you. So I'm going to stand up so that you guys can see me and I can arm wave at the screen. I think if I'm sitting at my chair, I'll have my head turned the whole time, right? But my name is Ryan Mitchell. I'm the chief hydrologist. So I oversee the hydrology division of the Department of Water Resources. So that is the group of scientists, so geologists, hydrologists, and engineers that collect, analyze, interpret, and model hydrologic data across the basin. So we're kind of the technical, nerdy science group of the department. So I get the fun part of the presentation, which is just the data and the plots and the graphs and all that stuff. So in the hydrology agenda for today, we'll discuss the region. I'll go over what existing geology, lithology, and hydro data we do have for this basin. discuss what index wells are and what index wells we have in the area. Go over some water level change statistics for the basin and that are relevant to Ranegras Plain. And then we'll look at what existing data that's out there, not only outside of the department, but what do we house and what do we have? And as Ben said earlier, anything that we collect is public record and is available for folks to use. So a lot of universities, students and consultants, scientists will use our raw information, our raw data. So I'll tell you what we have and how to access it, kind of show you what's out there for you guys to access for yourselves. That includes water level measurements, trends in the water level over time, and the differences in water level contours. So where are there areas where there's cones of depression, where's water being withdrawn from the aquifer itself? And then we'll discuss land subsidence at the end. So here we have a map of the basin. Hopefully you're all familiar with it. Where we sit in the state is in that little box. So you can see the index maps relative to Phoenix, about 100 miles to the west. The Ranegras Plain Basin is a closed basin, so that means that it has bounding mountains on all sides. It is in the Basin and Range physiographic province, so that means there was extensional block faulting that created high mountains on one side and then a trough in the middle. And in that trough in the middle is where sediments will settle over millions of years. And those sediments comprise the aquifer itself. So that is where the water is stored within the basin. The basin itself is just under 1,000 square miles, 912, comprises of desert. So we have high plain desert at about 930 feet elevation. We also have some mountain highs close to 4,000 feet in elevation, but not quite. There's little to no surface water to speak of in this basin, so no perennial streams or rivers or creeks. There are drainages for when there are storm events, and those are called ephemeral streams. Groundwater is the primary source of water, and like I said, it's found in the unconsolidated alluvium, so that loose sand and gravel that's in between the mountains and it's sitting on top of the bedrock in the Basin Valley. There are two different primary basin fill sediment units out in this basin. It's very standard or typical for these types of valleys across Arizona. There's a lower basin fill. That's usually where most of the water is found. And then there's the upper basin fill unit. And the upper basin fill units are typically going to be really fine-grained stuff like evaporative playas and lakes. And that's usually stuff you want to get through before you get down into where the groundwater is. And in this basin, there's about, on average, around 300 to 400 feet of upper basin fill before you get to the lower basin fill unit. In certain areas, it's as thick as 600 feet, but it all depends on the depositional environment at the time. There's about 5.5 inches of rainfall on the valley floor and about 8.5 inches of rainfall per year up in the mountains. And that's relevant because there's very little natural recharge in this basin. If you don't have any surface water bringing water to the basin itself, and if you don't have any basin to basin underflow, that means most of the recharge that happens with your aquifer is going to come from precipitation. And it's important to know because not all precipitation actually makes it to your aquifer. And I have a few slides later that'll describe that, and I'm happy to answer more questions too. There are some existing publications for the valley. The ones that I have listed here on the screen, all those links are active. So after the meeting today, all the slides will be posted. We'll have the recording of the video online on our website too. But this, you can just click and it'll take you right to these different publications for Ranegras Basin. These include hydrologic monitoring reports, general open file reports, and statistical reports. But if you want to just access more information than what we discussed today, I'm going to keep things kind of high level. If you want to get into more detail, these reports are great resources. So as I was discussing a second ago about water and how the recharge is one component, that's what adds water to your aquifer. There's this concept that we should discuss that's called a water budget. And just like it sounds, a budget, just like a financial budget, means you're receiving water, you're getting water into your bank account in one way, you're also spending it as you pump it out. And the question is, well, are you in balance or not? Are you getting enough water coming in to keep up with the spending that you're doing? So in hydrology, the term is a water budget. The equation here looks kind of complicated, but it really isn't. We'll talk about what these are in a second. The concept is super simple. But when you really try to quantify every last drop, where is it all coming from, and quantify every last drop, where is it all going, it can get really complicated kind of fast. But generally speaking, on one side of the equation, you have P, and then which is precipitation, and then Q, which is just a fancy hydro term for flow coming in. So rainfall and then any other water flow that's coming in, and that can be surface rivers or streams, or it could be two different basins that are touching where one is spilling into the other. Those are the inflow side of the equation. The other side of that equation is the outflow. So what is leaving your bank account of water? There's a term here called ET, which stands for evapotranspiration, which some folks in here are likely familiar with, but generally speaking, that is the consumptive use from plants. And that doesn't mean crops necessarily. That could be plants and vegetation that are near rivers or streams. They will actually take enough water out of the system that you see it in the water budgets when you're doing the calculations. So if you have a riparian area that has lots of vegetation, you will lose a good amount of water to ET in this equation. This component here that stands for delta S is change in storage. That's just letting you know if one side's bigger than the other, storage is going to go up or down, your balance is going to go up or down. And then the Q out, so the flows out. Flows out, you're not going to have reverse rainfall. The water's not going to be coming back up into the sky, but you will have basin to basin underflow. So if there are basins adjacent to yours, you could spill out some groundwater into it over time. And we do have some good studies that calculate this. But primarily, the most dominant component of this equation on the Q out in particular is groundwater pumping. So when you pump the water out of the aquifer, that is considered an outflow. But if you look, this is a cartoon or a little schematic, but it's representative here because there's a lot of things that happen within a basin. It rains, sometimes it rains on the valley floor, sometimes it rains up on the mountains, sometimes there's a river passing through, there's native vegetation, sometimes there's planted crops. It gets really complicated when you try to quantify all of it, but the concept in theory is kind of simple. Are you spending more water than you have coming into your aquifer? Are you in equilibrium? Are you in balance? One other thing to note, which I will discuss on the next slide, is a concept called mountain front recharge. When looking at this basin, the predominant inflow for this basin besides is the CAP canal plus the mountain front recharge. So when it rains and it rains on the basin, remember the top few hundred feet is really fine grained kind of dry stuff. If you have a really dry sponge and you sprinkle some water on it, the water actually doesn't drop out the bottom of the sponge. It doesn't move through the sponge and then go dripping out the bottom. It actually stays in the sponge on the top. A similar thing kind of happens with, this is overly simplistic, but does happen within a basin like this, where in the big flat area across the basin where the valley's flat, the rain that falls onto there, most of it sheds off. Most of it gets diverted to a stream or a drainage and it goes north. Whatever's left where the ground is still wet, or even if you have like some standing ponds or standing water, a lot of that actually goes into the dry sediments and goes down maybe about 10 feet, 20 feet, and that's about it. It doesn't actually make it down 300, 400 feet to the regional aquifer. So then the question is, well, then how does rainfall or precipitation recharge my aquifer then if it's part of the inflow components? And the way it does it is by the contact between the mountains with the basin fill on the side. So if you sprinkle water on a sponge, it won't transmit the water out the bottom unless the sponge is fully saturated, right? If the sponge is fully wet, then you can add more water and you can see it dripping out the bottom. And in a basin where it rains on the mountains, so the mountains don't let the water pass either. The mountains are hard, they don't absorb the water. The water kind of sheds down it. But where it does first contact the alluvium, like in this area here, there's not a whole lot that it has to saturate. It's really thin at first, and it wedges out as you go towards the basin. So what ends up happening is the water will actually recharge at that interface where the mountains are touching the alluvium. So mountain front recharge is a really big component to recharging the actual aquifer itself, because the water will keep this stuff saturated here, and it will travel down that face and get into the deeper regional aquifer system. That's why if any of you have wells that are closer to the mountains, you might see more fluctuation when it rains or stuff happens. You'll see a response happen more quickly. But if you're down in the deep basin, you'll say, hey, it rained for 5 days and my water level hasn't changed at all. And this is the reason why. So this is a similar cartoon to the previous slide or to the water budget slide where I was describing inflows and outflows, but it just shows it a little bit different. It's showing you how mountain front recharge, that's your precipitation, is one inflow. The stream flow, so if you had anything on the surface running, that would be a recharge point or an inflow. And then underflow from basin to basin would also be an inflow. Then the outflows, we have your ET, the evapotranspiration, stream flow out, underflow out. So this is natural conditions. This is as if there were no humans in the basin whatsoever. These phenomena would be going on. And over the millions of years, the basin will actually go into equilibrium and kind of be staying there. If there's too much water in there, it would end up spilling out into the next basin. If there's really too much water there, then you have a stream that starts to form at the surface and the water leaves that way. So how do we evaluate a water budget, or if the water budget is in equilibrium or not, if we don't have all of the details, all of the data? We don't know everything, right? There's a really easy kind of key indicator way that we do that, and that's by watching water levels in wells. So if your inflows are greater than your outflows, meaning you've got more coming into your aquifer system, more precipitation, more surface water, basin to basin underflow, we'll go around and we'll measure the depth of water in a bunch of wells throughout the basin over time, and we will see those water levels year after year slowly going up. So if the inflows are greater than outflows, your water levels are rising basically in the wells. And conversely, if your outflows are greater, we will see water levels declining, not just in one or two wells, but in like all the wells. Some will decline more than others, depending on where pumping centers are. But if we look across a basin and we see all the wells are going down, and we do when we look into the hydrology and we figure out what's going on in that basin, we can see whether or not the water budget is in balance or not. So what data do we have for inflows? This is a map that just shows, it's a precipitation map. And you can see it's about 5.5 inches of rainfall per year in the basin. That's the red colors. As you move towards the higher topography, higher elevations, you get a little bit more blue. The blue means that there was more rainfall up there. There's also a link here that can take you to these data if you want to check it out yourself. There is a publication that the USGS did in 2011 where they went through all of the western basins in Arizona, and they used that same prism precipitation data and calculated, because of the amount of rainfall they're seeing in each of these basins, they actually calculated for each individual basin what their mountain front recharge actually is. So we can do that too. You guys can do that as well. It's just some calculation number crunching, but they did us the courtesy of publishing it for us for all the different basins. And if you look on this particular publication, this link is real. So if you guys want to read this yourselves, you can. And go to this table. It says average annual mountain front recharge estimated for all these basins. We look at Ranegras Plain, and it's about 2,000 AF or acre feet. So who here knows what an acre foot is? So an acre foot is a unit of measurement for a volume of water that when you're talking about a whole lot of water, it's easier to use a big unit. So it is the amount of water it would take to cover 1 acre of land with 1 foot of water. So it's about 325,000 gallons, almost 326,000 gallons. So instead of reporting out numbers to people in like the millions or tens of millions of gallons, we'll use the term acre feet a lot. So Ranegras Plain has a published estimated mountain front recharge value of about 2,000 acre feet per year. And then the other component of the inflows I was discussing were the basin to basin underflows, where if one basin might spill into the other, that's happening way deep below your feet. It's happening very slowly, like 5 or 10 feet per day. That's how fast that water is moving. But you do get some kind of almost like tidal, you do get some kind of motion of groundwater from one basin to another. When we look at the Ranegras Basin, it is almost zero. It's not quite zero. There's a little bit of underflow coming in from Butler. And then there's also about the same leaving to the north through Baus. So in a water budget perspective, the basin to basin underflow, the inflows and outflows are about equal to kind of cancel each other out. and they're all occurring up at the north. So water's kind of coming in, making a U-turn and leaving, and not that much of it. Less than 1,000 acre feet per year. I've seen estimates of around 300 to 500 acre feet is what I keep seeing. So there is another element of inflow. This is not natural inflow, but another element of inflow that's impactful in this particular basin, which is CAP canal leakage. So the CAP canal does pass through here. It is cement lined, and water can actually work its way through cement over time. And there is always going to be some leaks and cracks, and there's going to be a little bit of seepage through the asphalt itself or through the concrete itself. So there was a publication done in support of a NEPA process for a solar facility where someone actually modeled the CAP canal. And their numbers are really consistent with what CAP themselves have published. But it's about 2,500 acre feet per year. So you guys, the Ranegras Plain Basin aquifer gets more water per year from leaking CAP canal than they do from precipitation, which is very minimal, is my point. Now let's talk about outflows. So we talked about a bunch of the inflows and then some of the outflows here. The USGS will go around. We don't have reported data for this basin. So in an irrigation on expansion area or an active management area, people have to report annually how much pumping they are doing. This is good for several reasons, for planning, but also for modeling and for things of just knowing you can't manage what you don't measure. But there is a method that you can go out, and the USGS will do this. They will map all the crops and crop types, and they'll record the irrigation method. And then they'll have to back calculate roughly how much water would be needed for this crop. Too many estimates involved for my taste. I prefer precision. I'd like to have the actual number. No one knows what they're pumping more than the person who's actually pumping. They know that number pretty well. But where we don't have that data, we need to rely on methods like this. So the USGS do publish this. They do it for the work for us, and it's all publicly available. And you can see that in the Ranegras Plain Basin, agricultural pumping only. So this is where this value is not the total picture for pumping, but it is a big portion of it. We see that pumping in the 50s and 60s was around, anywhere from 10, getting up to 20,000 acre feet per year. There's a big spike in the mid 80s, got up to 50,000. And then it kind of stabilized for a while around 30 to 25. But since 2016, the average has been hovering right around 40,000 acre feet per year. And this is purely agricultural pumping. There's estimated to be some additional industrial pumping and also any domestic pumping. So any of the like the less than 35 gallon per minute, small domestic wells, stock wells, and small scale pumps. There's a bunch of those too. So when we say 40,000 acre feet per year, the real number will be, plus some margin of error for all these other pumping that's not captured by that value. There is something called agricultural return flow. What that basically means is for all the water that gets pumped from the aquifer and sprayed onto your crops and irrigated on the land, we usually will estimate about 10% of it over time might make it back to the aquifer. So when we do like modeling work, sometimes we'll just take that 10% off the top to start with so that we don't have to put the money in the budget and then take it right back out again. We just take 10% off and then put that in as an outflow. But this is kind of what that looks like for the basin. The inflows are about 4,500 acre feet per year. And the outflows are 42,000 plus some margin of error. These dots are to scale. So that's about imagine you're spending that in dollars. You make $4,500 a year, but you're spending $42,000 a year. You're eating into your savings at that point. This is a condition that we refer to as groundwater mining, meaning if you were to stop pumping at 2,000 acre feet per year of natural recharge, it can take decades or centuries to recover. So this is the water budget component of my presentation, and we're going to move on to some other stuff. So how do we know this? How do we monitor this? How do we measure this? What do we do? One of the things that we do in my division, in my department, is we measure what we call index wells. So index wells are wells that we measure on a very regular basis, because if you measure a well in the summer versus the spring versus the winter, you'll get different measurements. So we have a whole program with a whole group of field hydrologists and geologists. They go out at the same week every year after year and measure the same wells. So they have a schedule, a very complicated schedule and rotation. And we measure about, it's a little more than 1,700 wells across the state. We collect water levels on all of them at least annually, but we do have several that we'll go to twice a year. Some will go to quarterly, and some that we will go to monthly. And then all of the data that we collect is available publicly. So this website, this link at the bottom, it'll actually take you to an interactive web map, kind of like Google Earth. And so if you click that link, it shows a map. It has just a bunch of dots on it. You can zoom into your neighborhood. You can zoom into your property. You can look around, click on any of those dots, and you will see whatever water level data we have for that well going back to the 40s. So what are some of the other existing data? That's statewide, but the existing data that we have within your basin itself, we have 19 active index wells. Sometimes index wells come and go. So currently we have 19. We usually would like to have as many as we can get. This is the distribution. The red is kind of tricky to see here, but we do have a fair distribution going through most of the valley. And then as we get to the south, we only have a couple. There's not a lot going on down there. Of those 19 wells, 18 of them are measured annually, and the 19th well actually has a pressure transducer in it. So it's a little probe that reads the water level multiple times per day, and it uploads those measurements every night. So that one we consider like real-time data. So you can log in anywhere at any time of the year and check out that well. We do another thing called basin sweeps. So every year we pick a handful of, there's 51 basins in the state, but it's a big state. We'll pick a handful of basins and we will go there out of the schedule of the other index wells. So when we have this free time with our staff, and we will measure the water level in every well we can access. And it's like a blitz. So if we were going to do it in Ranegras, we would contact every property owner, every well owner, everyone whose phone number we could find, and we will schedule and coordinate to where we can go out, and within like a couple of week period, we'll get hundreds of measurements all at once. And this is great to do. We try to do it as often as we can because it gives you a snapshot of the water table, one moment in time. And you say, I know what the depth of water is for all these hundreds of wells in this one period. And then if we do it multiple years, like here we did it in 88, 93, 98, 2004, 2016. If we do it in multiple years, we can then look back at those snapshots over time and we can see what is happening with the health of the aquifer. Is the water budget in balance or not? Is it going up or going down? Where is it going up or going down? So in these basin sweeps alone, so not the annual readings, we've collected over 2,300 measurements in just those sweep years. We will also come out if asked and if allowed, and we will measure the discharge rates and record that as well. That gives us well capacity values. Then we can, if we have access to a pumping water level, we can then calculate the specific capacity, which is more of a well specific, well yield kind of number, but it's good to know for when calculating the aquifer's properties, characteristics. And then we also collect land subsidence data and information, and I'll talk about that in a moment too. If there were any surface water out here, we would measure that too. The USGS does have stream gauges. There are no active gauges here, but we will come out and do surface water profile and work like that as well. So the next couple of slides, the next two slides, are slides that we presented at the Governor's Water Policy Council back in 2023 in August. And it'll take a little minute to explain what we're looking at here, but it's really useful data or information. We have a report. It's a report that we publish every couple of years where we take the water level statistics for all the 1,700 wells across the state, and we compare them from, we'll look back a year, we'll look back 10 years, we'll look back 15, 20 years, and we'll publish all of the statistics for the water level changes across the entire state, not just in any particular basin. And that report is called, the most recently published one is OFR, Open File Report number 20. And here's a link to it. What's significant or important about that is that for the Water Policy Council in 2023, we took the table 6 here that had any of the wells in the state, where we took a measurement in 2000 and we took another measurement 20 years later in 2020. We wanted to know in that 20-year period of record, in all the basins, did the water level go up, the water level go down, did it stay the same? And we did it for all these thousands of measurements. And when you're looking at a table with just tons and tons and tons of numbers, they don't mean anything anymore. There needs to be some way to visualize them. So what we did is we made box and whisker plots. So it looks a little goofy, but it conveys a lot of information with one little image or one little box and whisker. The box is this inside rectangle, and the whiskers are the top whisker and the bottom whisker. What this represents when we look at it on a plot are all of the numbers, all of the data points. So remember we said in this 20-year period, did the water level go up or down? And if so, by how much? So we got numbers like -10 feet, -9 feet, 0, 1 foot, 5 foot, whatever it is, whatever that water level change was. If you line them all up from the smallest number to the biggest number, and then just cut them into 4 equal parts, that's what these box and whiskers are. The bottom is the lowest 25% of the values. This next box here is the next quartile, or the next 25%. This next one is the middle third quartile, and then the upper quartile. What that means is I can show you guys a plot or a graph that just has a bunch of these boxes all over it, and you can know, oh, those are water level measurements, and that's, did the water level go up or down, or is it hovering right at 0? Is it, so for some basins where they're kind of in equilibrium, some of the box or the whisker data will be above a 0, some of it's below the 0, and the size of the box matters. So it tells you how many data points are there, and it tells you the distribution of the data points. So you can say, hey, this guy's actually hovering right over 0. That basin's pretty close to equilibrium. Well, when we did this exercise, there were 3 basins in the state that were not that had no regulatory structure, so meaning rural basins. So no AMAs, no INAs, no transportation basins. We said, of all the unregulated basins, what do they look like? 3 of them had all of their box and whisker plot data below 0. The rest of the basins across the state had some kind of mix. Oh, sorry. One last thing. If there's an outlier data, meaning like a number that's just way off from the rest of the group, we don't throw it away. We still keep it, but we flag it as saying, hey, that one's a little different than the rest. And we'll still show it on the box and whisker plots. So we went through, during the Governor's Water Policy Council meeting, all 51 basins. But here, I just pulled out the 3 because the plots got really busy. But you can see Gila Bend, Ranegras Plain, and Wilcox, they all had water level data going back 20 years, where we had consistent data, same time of year for the whole 20-year period. And none of them had a single well of record that had the water level go up over time. All of them went down. This is consistent and does make sense when you think of that water budget stuff. Where would the recharge be coming from? There's really not much here. And so it would make sense that the measurements over the 20-year period were all going down. It's just some went down more than others. So let's take a look at some wells. So we're going to look at a few plots that look just like this. On the left-hand side is the basin. The red boundary is the basin boundary. All those little blue dots are those index wells I was talking about a second ago. Down at the bottom, there's a blue hyperlink that if you click that will also take you to that interactive web map. And every well has a unique identification number, an ID. And for each of the hydrographs that I'm going to show, their ID are listed below. So if you wanted to look at this on your own computer with not just a screenshot from the presentation, you can go back and look and see these same things. But if you're poking around the map and you click on one of the wells, one of the options of a pop-up will show up, and one of the options says hydrograph. If you click the hydrograph, this is what you'll see next. So a hydrograph is, as it sounds, it's a water graph. So it's plotting the water level over time. On the axes, you have, on the left side, depth to water. So that says if I'm standing at the surface, how far below my feet would I measure before I touch the water? But on the right-hand side, you'll have water level elevation. And that's more like if there was no ground and I was looking at the surface of the water, how high above mean sea level, the ocean, what's the elevation of the water table? So they tell you the same thing, but there's different values. And on the bottom is your time scale. So here's a well that's to the north. So we remember we do have some water kind of coming in here and then kind of leaving here. And but overall the system is out of balance. But to the north, if it were me, I would expect to see the water level measurements be kind of flat up here because you do have water coming in and leaving, right? But we still see a decline. So our first measurement here was in 1948. Last one for this particular well is in 2022. So that's about a 30-foot decline over 74 years. If we move a little bit further down, so now we've jumped down to this guy. First measurement is 1946. Second measurement is in 2024. Here we see a 27-foot decline in 78 years. So these are long periods of record. These are multi-decade. Now, I should have mentioned, I'm sorry, this pink blob that you see in the middle of this map, we're going to talk about that in a little bit. That is the mapped land subsidence feature that we have in the basin here. So on all in this, it's nice to know where the subsidence feature is because usually those are the subsidence will show up where pumping is the heaviest. So we're getting close to the edge of the subsidence feature and we see a measurement from 1951, measurement 2024, about 100 feet now, 99 feet in 73 years. Makes sense. We have subsidence occurring. That's probably where more pumping is happening, right? Let's look at this guy. 1982, so not as far back in time. It's a little shorter period of record. 2024. Now we have 136 feet in 42 years. So like about half the time of these wells up here, but quadruple the amount of drawdown. And this one is interesting. At first, you say that doesn't look so bad, right? And then I would point out the scale to you. Instead of being in increments of 10 feet, these are in increments of hundreds of feet. So 1983 to 2023, that's 242 feet in 40 years. So you can see how pumping is concentrated in this particular area, and you can see it in the water level data. And then if we go down all the way to the south, we are now kind of away from the pumping centers. There's not a lot happening down there, and the amount of drawdown is still there, but it's less. So as a hydrologist, when I look at this distribution of water levels over time, it's pretty easy to draw the conclusion that you're extracting a lot of water out of the system and not replenishing it or recharging it. So that's one way to look at water level data over time, because that's well by well, it's very specific. And they have different time scales, but it does give you a sense of like what's happening in that particular area. Another way to look at it is like this. So this is a water level change contour map. So what we did, we had those basin sweep years where we went and took a bunch of measurements, is we took 2 of them and compared them. And when we compared them, we took the difference between those 2 like theoretical surfaces. So one water table is flat doing this, the other one's a little flat doing this. And we did some math and separated the 2 and said, what's the change or what's the difference from that 1 year to this year? And then we plotted the change as contours. So think of this as like if you're hiking and you pull out a topographic map. If you have the contour lines on your map, you see a bunch of lines together. That's usually like where a mountain is, right? Or where a valley might be. It's very similar. Each one of these lines represents a single number. So this line here is actually the negative 25-foot contour interval. That means from this 30-year period or 29-year period, less than 25 feet of change, water level change is happening here, less than 25 feet here. But as soon as you get to this line, everything is at least drawn down by 25 feet in that 30-year period. And then we jump to that next line, which is really close. That's 50 feet, then 75, and then 100. And where it gets to these red lines here, we're approaching 175, 200 feet. So this is a way of visualizing the whole basin. Where is the area where the water levels are dropping the fastest in this 30-year period? And you can see it's concentrated around Vicksburg in the south. So land subsidence, who here knows what that is? Anyone heard of it before? Okay. Land subsidence is a phenomenon where the land surface itself is actually going down or dropping. But it happens in a really, really big area and it happens kind of slowly. So you don't really perceive it because it's the slow creeping land drop, right? But how does it happen? What is it? How do we measure it? And do you guys have any happening in Ranegras? That's what I talk about next. Turning up my microphone for you. So this is a generic hydrologic block diagram. It's very schematic. It's meant to represent the land surface. This is the dry, unsaturated alluvium. The blue dashed line is the water table. And then below that, this is the saturated, this is your aquifer. This is where the water is. If we were to take a cubic foot of the aquifer down there where it's wet and pull it out, be able to look at it closely, we would see sand grains. So this stuff is like really small. You have fine sand, you have clays, you have silt, you have gravel, but you would see sand grain, which is the unconsolidated alluvial material. And in the interstitial pore space, the room in between them, you would have water. That is actually where your groundwater is, where it resides. And that's where you pump it from. It's in between the sand grains and it can move. I'll get to this next part. Where there is water, there's water pressure. So it's called hydrostatic pressure in this case. Down at depth, you have hydrostatic pressure that's actually helping to keep some of that pore space open. So it's almost like when you go down to the bottom of a pool and your ears want to pop, that's because the pressure of the water, the weight of the water is pressing against your ears. If the water can communicate with the atmosphere, meaning it's not confined, that means that the weight of the water is actually creating hydrostatic pressure in the aquifer too, which means simply it's pushing back against the sand some, the water is. So the sand wants to push on it and it's kind of pushing back a little bit saying, don't crush me. I'm not compressible. Don't push me or squeeze me, please. And that matters because when you remove that water from pumping, you now have less support in the skeleton of the aquifer, which means that what used to be a perfect cube will squeeze and compress in that interstitial pore space where the water used to be. And what used to be a cube is now a slightly flattened box. For 1 cubic foot, not a big deal. You won't even notice it. But if you stack up hundreds of feet in one area and extend it hundreds of feet, if not miles, around you, you'll create a condition where the entire land surface slowly starts to sink and compress down. That compression is happening down where the water used to be. It's not happening in the upper few hundred feet. It's happening down in depth. So the whole thing is kind of like settling down some and squeezing. That is what land subsidence is. The tricky thing about land subsidence, whenever you deform anything, there's always a elastic and inelastic component. Like you crunch a car together, some of it will kind of bounce back a little bit, but the majority of it gets crinkled. And that crinkled part's inelastic, meaning you can't stretch it back out. With this type of deformation, it's inelastic. It's predominantly inelastic, which means if I were to add water back and let the water level rise, it won't reinflate the pore space. It won't actually lift it back up again. That's why land subsidence is such a harmful thing to an aquifer system, because even if water levels were to come back up, the ability for the aquifer to store water in those little pore spaces has now been reduced. So it is considered a permanent loss of aquifer storage. It can still store some water, but not as much. There's not as much room there as there used to be. The way that we measure this or map this across the state is using satellites. These satellites that we use, I won't go into too much detail, but it uses a method that can see sub-millimeter elevation changes. And we know when we look at the data that the mountains aren't moving, but this area where all the alluvium and all the pumping is moving, that stuff is dropping down and dropping down and dropping down. We can see it in the data. This one's a little tricky to see, but these are all the different flight paths that we do our INSAR satellite data where our runs from. These are all the different satellite partners that we use because there's more than one satellite out there that collects this information. So we use all of them. And then here is a map of all of the subsidence features in the state. Hard to see, but all of these are published. We have over 850 maps published for subsidence in Arizona on our website. So the link here can take you there. But if you look, that is where we're discussing. So in Ranegras Plain, we have in the last 15 years about, in certain areas, up to 40 centimeters of land subsidence. And for you to drop down a little bit of land compression, you have to dewater a whole bunch of water for that to happen. So for every foot of subsidence, it's like hundreds of feet of water level drop. The ratio is really high. You have to really pump it hard before it starts to come down and compress. So we do have subsidence in Ranegras that is concerning. What is, in my opinion, a little bit more concerning is the rate of subsidence. So if we look at so we know the car is going really fast, we're subsiding now, but is it speeding up or is it slowing down? And if you go back to 1996, the rate of subsidence was like almost a centimeter per year, so pretty minimal. Then if you look at 2009 and 2010, how fast is the car going now? Now it's up to 3 centimeters per year, so it's speeding up, right? And then if we look to this last year, this last 12 months, it's approaching, it's at 5 centimeters per year. So the rate of subsidence year after year is increasing. And because it takes a lot to make the subsidence start, if everyone were to stop pumping and disappear out of the basin today, it would still be subsiding for a few more years before it slowed down and stopped again. It's like moving a train. So the fact that it's increasing is concerning to us. So to summarize the hydrology section, and then I'll pass it along. The water budget is out of balance. We see that in the water level data. Declines of over the 200 feet in the 40-year period. Land subsidence is occurring from the overpumping of groundwater. And the rate of subsidence is increasing and going up. And with that, I'm going to pass it off. I'll answer questions at the end, but for the next part of the presentation.
Thank you, Ryan. I'm going to also try to find the optimal spot in this room. Can everyone hear me okay? All right, perfect. All right, so hi everyone. Thank you to Ben for the introduction earlier. My name is Olga Hart. I am the Establishments Director at the Arizona Department of Water Resources. So that means I manage a team, some of who are here today in person, that's responsible for figuring out how we're going to be standing up new AMAs and INAs. And we also have a twin group to us that looks at data and analytics and provides some of that kind of analytical support to the establishments team. All right, so let's set the stage, right? So the story really begins for the Arizona Department of Water Resources with the Groundwater Management Act of 1980. It's what gives us the department's authority to manage water resources in the state. That same Groundwater Management Act also established certain regulations or certain regulatory structures for what options we have for managing water throughout the state. So it established the irrigation non-expansion areas and the active management areas. And that same act also stipulated that in addition to the initial irrigation non-expansion areas and active management areas that were created in 1980, the department also has the authority and the structure to create new irrigation non-expansion areas and new active management areas as the situation evolves and as new areas, may require those tools. And initiating those new or establishing those new irrigation non-expansion areas and active management areas can happen either through initiation locally or through the director of the Arizona Department of Water Resources initiating that process. And we'll come back to all of that here in a second. So we'll come back and do a deep dive. All right. So as of today, we have 7 active management areas throughout the state, and we have 3 irrigation non-expansion areas. So in 1980, we began with Prescott, Phoenix, Pinal, and Tucson. And in 1980, the Tucson active management area actually included what was later in 1994 split off and recognized as its own separate active management area in Santa Cruz. Since then, we've established 2 additional active management areas, the first being in Douglas in 2022, and the other one in Wilcox earlier this year in January of 2025. We also began in 1980 with 1 irrigation non-expansion area in Joseph City, And then a year later, following the passage of the Groundwater Management Act, we added Harquahala. And then again, more recently in 2022, we have also added Hualapai Valley. One thing I want to call to your attention here on the screen, you can see on the map. So the active management area is right in this orange salmon color. The irrigation non-expansion areas in blue. Outside of those areas, water protections or tools in the department's toolbox to do much about managing water resources are more limited. And we're going to take a deeper dive into what that means, right? What does it mean to be more limited, and what does it mean for these tools or toolboxes to stack? So statewide, the department has statutory authority to require the registration of all wells, not the metering and not the reporting of them, but the registration of their construction, changes in land ownership, etc. We also have reporting requirements for public water systems. You may have also heard of those being referred to as community water systems, right? So not requirements, not water limits, but requirements to report. And we also have the adequate water supply program. So this is for residential subdevelopments. There are requirements that specify the developers have to demonstrate 100 years of continuously available water, physical, legal availability before they're allowed to sell parcels. That's statewide, right? And those you can kind of see are relatively limited. As we move from the left to the right in the chart, we're adding extra tools to our toolbox of water management options, right? So as we move to the irrigation non-expansion areas, we keep all of those same relevant requirements that we have statewide, but we also add the ability to curtail the expansion of irrigation acreage, right? Because we're in an irrigation non-expansion area now. We also can then enact withdrawal authorities for irrigation use. Thanks for okay. And we also then, we can see that we're now adding a metering and reporting requirement, right? So we started with just registering wells, but then in an in an irrigation non-expansion area, we are now beginning to require some metering and reporting. Then moving on further to the active management areas, so our most resourced toolbox, right, with the most tools in it for water management and for water protection. All of those same things, all of the statewide requirements continue, still have to register wells, right? Irrigation, the non-expansion of irrigation acreage ports over from the irrigation non-expansion column. We still have metering and reporting requirements, but we add additional tools or additional requirements. So now we're talking about grandfathered water rights and withdrawal permits, not only for irrigation, but also for municipal and industrial non-exempt use. We add well impact analyses for non-exempt wells. We also are now able to provide management goals, management plans, and conservation programs for those agricultural, industrial, and municipal users. And we have the assured water supply program. So similar to the adequate water supply program, but in addition to all of the criteria that those developers need to meet outside of the AMAs, they also have to demonstrate that the proposed additional water use that they are, looking to secure would be consistent with whatever the AMA decides is going to be the management goal and the management plan. So just provide some additional tools and additional protection. All right, so we're going to look at the far right-hand side of that chart we just looked at and dive in a little bit deeper. So we talked about there being 4 unique tools, right, or requirements in active management areas when it comes to water regulations that under statute, the department is able to bring to the table. The first of those we touched on was measuring and reporting. So non-exempt wells pumping more than 35 gallons per minute now become required to measure their water use and to submit those numbers to the department annually through annual reports. We also add the well impact analysis requirement. So again, this is for non-exempt wells. It's a requirement that's intended to limit the impact of new wells on existing well owners and well use. We also have conservation programs. So these are, these stipulate or set up conservation requirements, as the name implies, for agricultural users, for municipal users, and for industrial users. These are developed, we've been developing them with as much local input and collaboration as we can. There's a lot of flexibility in the statutes for the new established AMA, so not your Phoenix, Prescott, Pinal, Tucson, Santa Cruz, but the new ones, to be very flexible and to try to develop conservation programs that best suit the local context, right? The local hydrology, as Ryan discussed, the local economy, and the local water use and users. And then finally, the Assured Water Supply Program. So I mentioned this is the 100-year water supply program. It's intended to be a consumer protection program for homeowners, and it's ensuring that developers that come in and wish to develop land into residential subdivisions can demonstrate that they have the legal and the physical rights to the water, and that that is consistent with whatever the conservation programs, the management goal, and the management plan set forth. All right, so I keep saying exempt wells, I keep saying non-exempt wells, right? Let's take a second here and go over what that means. So an exempt well has to meet 3 criteria. It has to be a well that has a pump capacity of 35 gallons per minute or less, and it has to also use less than 10 acre-feet per year for a non-irrigation use. And then finally, it's not used to irrigate 2 or more acres of land. So if your well meets all 3 criteria, if you can check each one of those boxes, and it's an exempt well. And if it's an exempt well, that means it's exempt from the requirement to obtain a grandfather right or withdrawal authority. So that doesn't apply to you. You don't need to get that right. You don't need to get that authority. You can continue using your exempt well. It also exempts you from the requirement to measure and report withdrawals. So you don't need to measure your water use. You don't need to report it to the department. It also exempts you from any conservation requirements in the management plan. So we talked about those conservation programs briefly that apply to municipal, agricultural, and industrial uses. They do not apply to exempt wells. So that is something else you don't have to deal with, right? Or manage. That said, some of those statewide requirements still apply to exempt wells, right? And that's that last bullet point over there on the right. So even if you are an exempt well owner, you still must register the well. And if at any point in your ownership of that well, you change the ownership of the well changes, or you do any modifications on the well, let's say you deepen it, let's say you put in, a different casing, you have to register the well and you have to provide documentation about those changes to the department. All right, so we had that disclaimer, right? What is an exempt well? What is not an exempt well? And we're going to come back to that deep dive on what those programs within the active management areas look like. So we touched on meter and reporting, and we're going to come back to that again. So within an AMA, those non-exempt wells, those that are pumping over 35 gallons per minute, they're required to meter their water use, and they're required to report it annually to the Department of Water Resources. Non-exempt well users are required to obtain a grandfathered right or withdrawal authority, right? So we just talked about this. If you're exempt, you don't have to do this. If you're non-exempt, you do. Just flagging this again, most domestic wells, most stock watering wells, those are going to most likely qualify as exempt wells. So this is not going to apply to you. We do have an FAQ section on the website for Ranegras. We try to address some of the more, frequently asked questions. If you have additional questions about what the difference between exempt or non-exempt, which of these requirements might apply to you, I encourage you to take a look, but we're also here today specifically to address questions, of course. So just flagging that as a helpful resource, but ask away when we get to the Q&A here in just a few slides. All right. Moving on, another requirement or another tool in the toolbox for managing water in an active management area are the well impact analyses. So all new non-exempt wells within an AMA are required to do a well impact analysis before they can be approved by the department. You'll note we underlined two words here, right? New and non-exempt. So this doesn't apply to existing non-exempt wells, and this does not apply to new exempt wells. So it's just new non-exempt wells have to demonstrate they're not going to cause undue harm to other existing users in their vicinity. And there's actually a very specific definition for what that harm is. And it's that, see if I can use there we go, the laser pointer. So they have to demonstrate through a hydrologic study submitted to the department that their proposed water use at the proposed location they're going to be putting in that hypothetical well is not going to exceed over 10 feet of additional drawdown in the first 5 years of operation. So if they meet that criteria, green light. If they don't, red light. All right. The third of the 4 active management area tools we talked about are the conservation programs. So let's start off in this nice graphic just to break up the text a little bit. So conservation programs don't exist in a vacuum. We start collaboratively developing a management goal for an active management area. So the department, in collaboration and close consultation with the local community, that becomes fleshed out in a management plan, and the management plan contains these conservation programs that are intended to drive groundwater use conservation, right, in accordance to try to get to that management goal. These conservation programs are designed for agricultural, municipal, and industrial water users. Like I said, local input, collaboration is key, and we have a lot of flexibility in the subsequent AMAs, so Douglas, Wilcox, etc., anything coming up, to tailor these conservation programs to what makes sense locally. So the conservation programs in any upcoming AMAs don't have to look like conservation programs in Phoenix, right? So the Wilcox conservation programs don't have to look like the conservation programs in Douglas. There's a lot of emphasis on making sure these things work so they can be followed, because really the goal, no pun intended, is to get to that management goal. All right. And then 4 on our list of 4 programs within the active management areas is the Assured Water Supply Program. So that consumer protection program, 100 years of water supply. It has these 4 or 5, however you want to count them, requirements. So the first 3, the physical, legal, and continuous availability, financial capability, and quality, those also apply to the adequate water supply program, but you have these additional goals, or additional requirements all the way on the right of consistency with management plan and goal that kick in the active management area. Physical, legal, and continuous availability, a developer has to demonstrate that they have secured legal water rights, so they have rights to the water they're planning to serve. That water is physically available and is continuously available for 100 years. And if there's some uncertainty about its continuous availability, that they've secured backup supplies to be able to serve, the homeowners continuously for 100 years. They also have to demonstrate financial capability, that they have the financial means to build out whatever infrastructure they need to treat, to store, to deliver that water, and that they're going to be in a position to do that throughout the 100 years. If there are any water quality standards, Ben summed this up very well in the introduction. We are not the water quality people, but as part of the Assured Water Supply Program, developers have to demonstrate that they will comply with any applicable water quality standards for either the source of the water and/or end uses of it, whatever applies to their situation. And then finally, what does apply to our department, right into the active management area, is that consistency with management plan and goal. So the onus is on the developer to demonstrate that that additional new use of water that they are proposing or asking for is going to be consistent with whatever the AMA management plan is, and the conservation programs within it, and consistent with the management goal. All right, so we're going to shift gears. So we finished talking about the tools in the toolbox. We talked a little bit about what differentiates statewide options for water management from what happens in the irrigation on expansion areas and the active management areas. We're going to shift gears to talk about how these are created. So this is now several slides back. I know we've been here for a while, so memory might be starting to slip. One of the things we talked about when I first kicked off my section of the slides is that irrigation on expansion areas and active management areas can be created one of two ways, or rather they can be initiated one of two ways. They can be initiated locally, or they can be initiated by the director of the Department of Water Resources. So we're going to walk through what that means, right? So we're going to start off with what this process looks like if it's initiated by the director of the Department of Water Resources. Let's start with the left and we'll move to the right. So if the director wishes to initiate an irrigation on expansion area, he or she needs to hold a public hearing. That is not what this meeting is today, right? This is an informational session. This is not a hearing. A hearing is a very different, very formal process. During that hearing, public comments are going to be made during the hearing itself. Following the hearing, the director is going to take all of the evidence he has available, right? All of the science from folks like Ryan and team, all of the evidence that also comes in through public comments during the hearing or following. And he or she is going to take all of that evidence into account and evaluate that evidence against two criteria. So the first is there insufficient groundwater for irrigation at the current rates of withdrawal? And is it not required to have an AMA according to the AMA criteria on the right? So both of those have to be met, right? There has to be insufficient groundwater for irrigation at the current rates of withdrawal, and there needs to not be a need for an active management area according to those three criteria on the right. If the evidence suggests the answer to those two questions is on the left is a yes, then the director can make that decision to designate or establish a new irrigation on expansion area. On the right, that process for establishing an active management area begins much the same way. So with a public hearing, right? And again, this is not what we're having today, but that is the first step. So the director holds a public hearing, takes into account all of the scientific evidence that the department has supplemented with any public comments and any other evidence that comes in other ways, and he or she have to evaluate three criteria. So the first is the active management practices are necessary to preserve groundwater supplies, or the land subsidence or fishing is endangering property or groundwater storage capacity in the basin, or that the use of groundwater is resulting in or threatening to result in water quality degradation. You notice these are all ors, right? So either one of those three conditions has to be met for the criteria to be met. If any of those are true, the director can then choose to designate or to initiate an active management area. All right. The other pathway to the creation of an irrigation on expansion area or an active management area in a new part of the state is through local initiation. So again, we'll start left and go right. So for an irrigation on expansion area, if that area is initiated locally, things begin with a petition to the Arizona Department of Water Resources that prompts a public hearing, and then all of the available evidence, including public comments, anything that's surfaced in that hearing is taken into account by the director as he or she review those two same criteria, right? So the first being, is there indeed insufficient groundwater for irrigation at the current rates of withdrawal? And is an establishment of an AMA not necessary according to that AMA criteria we saw on the previous slide? If the answer is yes, the director can make the decision then, right, to initiate a new irrigation on expansion area. Moving over to the right, local initiation of an active management area also begins with a petition, but the petition does not come to the department. The petition puts a measure on the local ballot. And after the local election takes place, once the election is certified, if the measure receives a majority vote, the active management area comes to be. Okay, this is our last slide. This is a summary slide, and then we're going to transition to Q&A. Yes, that's the energy we've been missing in this room this entire time. Wonderful. Okay, we'll keep this brief. So just to refresh everyone what we talked about there being 2 existing structures currently for groundwater management in Arizona. Both of those have different levels of conservation requirements and different levels of protection for groundwater resources. One being the irrigation non-expansion areas, the second being active management areas. We also talked about new irrigation non-expansion areas and new active management areas can be created through formal processes that are either initiated locally through local initiation or directly by the Arizona Department of Water Resources director. And we also covered the state laws that specify, or rather we covered the criteria that are specified by state law that the director has to evaluate the creation of INAs or AMAs against. All right, we did it. I'm going to hand the mic back over for Ben.
Thanks. Oh, yes. Well, maybe, I don't know. When I went to law school, I did go to law school, and I took a water law class. It nearly killed me, but I learned most of this, I thought, and I've been in the water space ever since, and I'm still learning new stuff. There's a lot there. And so I'm sorry. But also, like Ryan said, back in 2023, the department identified that there were 3 basins of serious concern, right? Wilcox, Gila Bend, and Ranegras Plain. So it's important for us to come to you to show you the data that we have, to show you the tools that we have, and to make sure that you're informed and able to give us feedback. Like Olga said, we are not here to say there's a new structure, there is a new regulation, but we are here letting you know what we have, what we can do, what we can't do, and the data that we have. So at this point, we want to open that up to all of you. I want to reiterate, you saw a lot. There's no expectation that you would be able to walk away with a fully formed understanding of all of these structures, but we are here to be helpful in that way. We have resources online. We are at your disposal, however we can help. So I want to preface that so that as you formulate your questions, if you have them, I expect that there would be some or comments that understanding is there. We have a few cards here. We have a few folks online. We have 1 person online. So we'll go back and forth with these cards. And then once we've worked through there, if there are additional questions, we'll take them. We're not so formal that we would ignore a raised hand. Who do we have online?
We have Jennifer Martin McLeod. Do we want to start with the online? All right, cool. Jennifer, I'm going to go ahead and send you an unmute request. And I'll send that now, and you'll accept that and go ahead with your question.
Hi, thanks all. Can you hear me okay?
We can.
Great, thanks. This is Jennifer Martin McLeod with the Grand Canyon chapter of the Sierra Club. In light of everything that you all have laid out, it's clear to us that some action is desperately needed, and this is the action that's available at this time due to the inaction of the legislature to create any additional tools. So that said, we're very supportive of the proposed AMA. And so my question is, how can we assist in moving this forward in the best way?
Thank you. I think from our point of view, and I certainly am not at a place and do not want to comment on anything happening at the legislature, but what I can say is that what I think would be most helpful is whatever we can do to understand how folks out here feel. I think that's the most useful to us right now, is to understand what you're seeing, what you're thinking, how you see what's available to you here. Because if it is the case, and I'm using if on purpose, if it is the case that a new AMA would be structured here, we would need help and buy-in from folks here all throughout every step of the process, because developing the goal for an area, understanding how conservation programs would look, that has to happen with input from the community. And that's something that we're working very hard to do in Wilcox, for example, something that was had to be done in Douglas. So that's, I think, the biggest need is conversations like what we're having now. I'll turn to these cards. The first one I have is for Rick Grimes. I don't know where. Understood.
Talk very loud. My question is, if you start regulating the wells, and I'm going to use farmers, and I am pro ag, by the way, how you determine how much to take away from the wells or from the farmer?
Oh, well, I'll stay right next to you, Rick. I grew up in near Safford. I'm not from Safford, but I grew up near there. And if anything I say comes off as anti-ag, I won't get invited back for Christmas. So advisedly, what I'll say is, like Olga had talked about, if an active management area is created or if an irrigation non-expansion area is created, there are requirements for metering wells, right? Right now there's registration requirements, but that's what it would be. Now, I said metering. I should be more clear because Daniel's watching me. Either metering or there are ways to estimate the amount of water that you're using based on the energy that you expend, right? So in some cases, a meter could be cost prohibitive. So there are options available as well, but you had a follow up.
Who determines how much water is in the basin that the farmers, I'm talking about farmers too, that they're pumping out of the basin? Is that something that's done by the state, or do you bring in an independent council to do that?
So the question was, who determines how much water is being used? You said specifically to agriculture, although it doesn't necessarily have to be just agriculture. What Ryan had talked about, the data that we have right now are estimates. Estimates based on the type of crops being grown, and smart folks smarter than I am, an attorney, so what do I know? But smart people who do look at the crops being grown and they say, to grow that kind of crop, you got to use a certain amount of water. Now, if pumping, if we're required to meter pumping or to measure, estimate pumping, then we would know, right? We would know how much water people are pulling out. But until that time, the best we can do is rely on those estimates. All right, the next, yeah, of course. The next one I have is Hein Hettinga. Forgive me if I said that wrong. Right over here.
Not a problem. Thank you for allowing me to speak. So my name is Hein Hettinga. I'm a third generation dairy farmer. I'm with GH Dairy in Vicksburg, Arizona. I just want to say when my grandfather built those dairies years ago, when we acquired the land, it was all flood. We took the flood out, put in pivots. We actually went down an acreage years ago, took all the corners out. So we're constantly looking at ways to be more efficient with our water. With our cows, we're constantly culling out our bottom end cows that don't produce. We're working on genetics with our cows, making our cows more feed efficient to produce more milk. I'm just wondering, if we go down on water, how are we going to feed our cows? How are we going to water our cows? If we have to move our cows out, I mean, how are people going to eat? We produce a lot of milk and a lot of cheese.
I'm going to ask a follow-up to make sure I answer you correctly. When you say if we go down, and I want to, sure.
Sorry about that. So if we have to meter our wells and we have to take out a bunch of acreage, how are we going to feed our cows and how are we going to water our cows without having access to that water?
I wanted to make sure that I wasn't misunderstanding if you're talking about if wells go down, regardless of something the department were to do. So the question, I'm glad for this question, is if you are required to take land out of production. Got it. Land already in production. Got it. Okay. An important element for how irrigation non-expansion areas and active management areas work. Back in 1980, when they were figuring out the contours of these programs, they knew there were folks out there who were pulling groundwater out of the ground. They were irrigating with it, right? Our constitutions have a pesky little thing about how you can't take property. The government can't take property. They taught me that in law school too. So what are they going to do when people are already putting that water to use, right? They've already got that. What options does the government have? Well, they said, we're going to just grandfather those folks in, right? We're going to limit new folks who can come in, right? They haven't done anything yet. But if you're already here, we're grandfathering you in. And they gave to those first active management areas that they created, and then the AMAs that came later and the INAs that came later as well, they gave them what are called, or at least in the AMAs, what are called grandfathered rights, irrigation grandfathered rights. That's based on the land that you've already put into production. Okay, so if an active management area were to come here and you've laid out ground and you're irrigating that ground, you will have, assuming that you apply for and acquire a grandfathered right, and that's important. You won't want to sit on that right. You want to take the steps to make sure that you get that, but you'll have the right to irrigate that land. Now, you talked about ways that you could become more efficient. That's important, right? Because, when you talk to farmers, you realize that those folks know about conservation, not only because it's the right thing to do, but water's expensive to pull up out of the ground. It's heavy, right? Right. So if you have an irrigation grandfathered right, there would be associated with that conservation requirements. And those conservation requirements are meant to push folks towards being as efficient as they can be, looking towards a future that is economically and technologically feasible, but is going to be reducing the amount of water used. But to your question, when you say pull land out of production, what I'm hearing is taking land that's already there and getting rid of it. And that's not what the irrigation grandfathered rights do. They grandfather in those acres. Yes, please do.
So if I have an existing well that's 50 years old that collapses, am I allowed, as long as I get the permits, to drill another well nearby just to get the same amount of water that I was pulling before to take care of that pre-existing irrigated ground?
That's a great question. So there's two things that I'm going to be thinking about, right? When I answer that, the first is, where are you going to put that water, right? We're talking about the land that was irrigated previously. And I'll notice that there's like, if some of your acres are damaged by floods, we do allow for some movement, right? Which makes sense, right? But also the drilling of replacement wells, there it is provided for. Now it can get pretty tricky. You probably don't want to get into all the details of it, but that is an option. Yes, ma'am. That very good question. The question for those who may not have heard, if you have land in irrigation, grandfathered in, and then that property owner sells that land, what happens to the right? That right continues, right? It is tied to the land. And so your land has your land only has value if you're able to put it to use, right? And if you've got agricultural land, but you can't irrigate it, you don't have agricultural land anymore, right? That IGFR, that we call it irrigation grandfathered right. Well, I'll call it an IGFR and I'll try not to use acronyms, but that would continue. You would be able to sell it with the land. All right, the last question I have on a card. Ms. Miltner.
Thank you. I really appreciate you guys coming out because we have had questions about this basin for a very long time. I have a couple of questions. I'll start with that. You talked about that we're off balance, and clearly we're well off balance. If we kept at our current rate of pull, is there any projections on how long we would last? That's a Ryan question.
Thanks, Ben. No. No, to do that type of predictive simulation work, you would need to develop a groundwater flow model So anything that we would do now would just be based on water level trends. So we would say, hey, this well is declining at an average rate of this. This well might go dry at a certain point. But groundwater doesn't move like it does in a lake. It can hydraulic conductivity and the way it moves through soil and sediment is a little tricky. And you do want to develop something that's more robust, a more robust tool like a model. Then which we would do if this were to be a regulated basin, we would develop one. And then you can use that to do the 100-year future water supply predictions and kind of see what the picture looks like. And that can change year after year as new data comes in. But right now, we don't have a tool like that for this particular basin.
Okay, so to follow up on that, do we know how much water that is in this basin?
I've seen a few different estimates and they do range quite a bit. So the thing about water is you hear a really big number and you say, hey, that's a lot of water. So we're great. But the problem is that not a lot of it's accessible. Not only is it physically too deep to pump without costing you millions of dollars just to put the well in, but a lot of the water, if you do a calculation like that, is actually bound up or trapped up in the formation itself. And there's a term called specific yield, which is how much water can you pump out of that little cube. But whenever you have that little cube of sediment and soil and you let the water come out, there's going to be some water left behind, right? It's still damp. And that term is called specific retention, is the phrase, or the hydrologic term. So whenever you hear these huge numbers for basins and you say, that's a lot of water, and you go, well, not only can you not really get to it, but not all of it will come out if you were to pump it. So the numbers I've seen are from like just really like gross estimates are like around like 18 to 22 million acre feet total. And that's the entire basin. So that's not right where you are, where you can get to it. What I like about using a tool like a model is that you can actually run the simulations out and see not just how much water is there, but how much can you actually get out based on where the wells are before the water level gets too deep to where pumping is not feasible. So that's a different tool that is complex, takes several years to make one, and we don't have one for this basin right now.
Okay, but that would be something that would come in if we were looking at an INA or an
If
AMA.
in any active management area, part of that assured water supply program requirement means that if someone wants to sell homes, like to subdivide property for sale housing, they have to show that there's a 100-year supply of water. And the way that you do the physical availability demonstration is with a model. So sometimes like an applicant, like in an area where there isn't an existing model, will like hire a consulting firm to make one for them for their application. But that doesn't mean that we accept that model. We'd have to go through and review it. It's better practice, in my opinion, that we be the ones, the department is the ones to give the tool, to give out the model to let people use instead of having to hire consultants to build one. But point being, yes, if there were any kind of regulatory framework here, then there would be eventually a model that would be used in the future for planning and for decision making. But it would be several years before there was one, whether it was developed privately by an applicant or if we did it in-house with the department. They're not fast. They take a long time. Well, I've seen a few different published values, but some of these estimates were from some were from the 70s, some were from the early 2000s. But I've seen a range. I've seen like 16 or 18 million, and I've seen as high as 22 million. But does that mean, is that the total amount of water from the depth of water to say a couple hundred feet down all the way to the bedrock? Because in the southern half of the valley, the depth to bedrock is almost 5,000 feet below land surface. And so you say, sure, there's water down there, but it's not accessible. And it's almost the difference between like a resource or a reserve. It's not a resource until it's economically viable. So there might be water that's deep, but that doesn't mean it's actually available.
If I can ask just one more question, then I'll pass it on. We've had some recent interest in our water, in our basin. As far as the ADWR is, without a INA or an AMA in place, as it stands right now, if we have some of those higher water consumers looking at putting wells in, is there any tools in your box right now to have input or prevent maybe that kind of thing happening, especially looking at how much we are off balance already?
In the context of your question, no, we don't have anything that we can do for the most part.
I just want to clarify. I just want to clarify, Ryan, that I think you meant we don't have anything outside of the active management area and INA tools.
Right.
Obviously, those would provide the restrictions for new water users coming in, but outside of those, no.
Okay, those are all the cards. I see one question here, and then after that, I'll work the room as long as I see a second one here. So I've got 2 in the queue. It's probably enough for the next 2, 3. All right. And then we'll keep working that way. If when I hand you the mic, you could let us know your name and whether you're here representing somebody, that'll help us. I don't know all your names yet. I'd like to try and get there. Probably won't today. I can't even remember my folks. So, all right.
Hi, Denise Beasley, and I'm from the Baus area and the Chamber of Commerce. And one of the things I kind of want to move it a little bit to more of the private wells and the residents, which a multitude of people here, that's where we get our water, is from our private wells on our land. And one of the concerns was, I know you talked about the non-exempt. So how do we get that non-exempt status? Is that something that our wells have to be monitored? They have to be checked, depths have to be checked. At whose expense would that be? And how do we get there? That's part of the, just on a kind of a secondary note, as we discussed this in a recent meeting with residents. And that's kind of the fear and the concern that we saw in our group is, don't monitor my well. This is my private property. It's just my use, and a fear that that will come. And in order to get the public on board with what we really need to do to control our water, we have to earn that respect. We have to earn their trust to know that my well is not going to be monitored. What I do on that, even if I'm, that non-exempt, and can it be lost, and kind of the space on that.
I'm walking over to Emily, who knows more than me, to make sure. I'll adjust, I think, with the second part, like sort of a nested piece first, because you said, how do we earn the respect of the community? God, I hope we can, right? That's why we're here, to try and earn, I think is the right word, that buy-in, that respect. I don't expect us to have it yet. I don't think we've earned it yet. But that's why we're here having these conversations. The second part, of course, was how do you get there, and how, what requirements are there, and how do you make sure it's not lost? Oh, and how much does it cost, right? Maybe the most important. Do you want to speak to that? Right.
So. Wait. So we're talking about exempt wells. So these are the small wells that are not subject to any of the requirements. And so for these wells, there are some requirements that you'd have to meet. Like we talked about, they'd have to have that 30, less than 35 gallons per minute pumping capacity, the less than 10 acre feet per year requirements. And then outside of that, you're not required to measure and report. So when you register your well with ADWR, you would register, you would include information about the pump capacity, and outside of that, ADWR really isn't involved with exempt wells. So. The, no, there's not additional proof requirements like that. When you would register the well, which, wells are registered statewide, include the information about the well. And outside of that, again, ADWR really isn't involved. Nobody's coming out and checking and requiring additional proof.
Yeah, just to clarify a little bit further, that's one of the requirements that applies statewide, that you register your well, and that if there's any change in ownership of the well, that you report that to the Department of Water Resources so that our records are up to date and correct. But there would be no, if you've already registered your well, there's nothing more for you to do as an exempt well owner. Any requirements would simply be on, those non-exempt well owners. Does that make sense? Okay. Yeah. Yeah, understandable. Yeah. Yeah, we couldn't even possibly manage that. Yeah. 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 Thank you for your question. Really appreciate it.
Yeah, it sounds like maybe that's something that we can add to the website to give more clarity. But it will know, we're really going to know whether you have that kind of capacity. We don't put a speedometer on a bicycle. We're not worried about the speed limit with a bicycle in the same way that a very small well, we're not worried about the kind of pumping that we're seeing. Did you have a follow-up to that point? Oh, okay. Well, I'll keep you in the queue. I think I'm going to go over here to number 2, if that's okay.
John Lehman. So I guess I'm just trying to understand the gravity of what's going on. And so you know how deep all the wells are, and you know how fast the tables are going down in different areas in our basin. And so do 20% of our wells run dry in 20 years, in 100 years? Residential wells. I don't know that most of the commercial guys got a handle of their wells, I'm sure. But us residential people, we may not know how fast the water is going down and how much of us are going to have to drill a new well and how soon out, right? Everything else that you said is a lot of information, and I'm sure it means a lot to you, but for me to grasp that, I don't know how. Is it a red flag? Is it a yellow flag? That type of scenario.
So similar to my previous response where I said to really know, like with some, not absolute certainty, but relative certainty would be to do a model. So if we did a model, we could look at the basin and do predictions. Without a model, the next best thing that you can do is, when I had that map up that had the different color contour lines, and I said the first one is 25 feet, but as you move towards to the east, and it goes from blue to red, now we're looking at 150, 175, 200 feet of drawdown in the last 30 years. What you can do is look at water level trends like that and say, depending on where I am in the basin, I can actually look and see from all the water level measurements we've taken over the decades, what is that rate of decline in my general area? And you can get like a ballpark number, but it won't be perfectly right. So you could potentially say, hey, it's going to drop another 200 feet in 30 years. I might be dry in 30 years, but conditions can change. In that 30-year period, people near you could be pumping harder, and that will actually exacerbate the drawdown. The drawdown is not linear, right? So, if people start backing off the pumps, then you might actually see it respond, and that could mean you have more than 30 years. So it's really hard to say with certainty. But the best thing that I would do is I would look on that GWSI website, the one that I said looks like Google Earth with all the dots on it with the wells. And I would look near your property or your area and see what are the nearest wells that we have a long period of record, and say, what is the depth of water doing over time to the wells that are close to me? And then you can use those as a way of kind of just extrapolating and say, all right, these wells that are next to me or within a couple of miles are all declining at 5 feet per year. I'm going to assume that I'm going to be in that 5 foot per year, like kind of drawdown situation. even though you're not extracting all that water, that's what the aquifer response is doing next to you, right? And then you can kind of estimate or predict, but you won't have any absolute certainty. Does that help?
My wells, I think most of us know what our well's doing. My question is when you go out and test the depth of the well every year, you know that it's a 600-foot well and you know how far it's going down. And we can assume that once we get down to within the last 10 feet of the well water, of the depth of the well, it's going to go dry. And I have no idea if, we're going to see well trucks all over the place, if that's a big deal, if it's a red flag or just a yellow flag.
So
But I would expect that you would have all of that data all modeled out.
for the wells that we monitor, none of them are pumping wells. Because pumping rates will give you an erroneous water level measurement. If the well's been pumping recently, or if you just had it on, you just turned it off, that's not the static level, right? The static water level. And so the wells that we look at or we monitor are usually wells that are not in service, that people give us like land access. Some of them are state land wells. And those ones, we know what the construction is, so we know how deep they are. And if the well is 50 feet away from drawing down, it's 5 feet per year of decline, then we know we've only got 10 years left on that well before we need to find a new monitoring point. But what we're monitoring in these conditions, we're trying to get the aquifer, not well specific. We care more about if the aquifer itself, the whole thing is declining and how much and what that looks like. But we would need to do, there'd be probably is a way to look at our wells that we do monitor, those 19 wells that we have access to, and I could probably estimate when each one of those would go dry. The ones that are to the north and to the south, it could be decades because that part of the basin is declining, but not at a very steep rate. But the wells that are closer to the center part of the basin on the eastern side will likely be going dry faster, right? So I can do that analysis for our existing wells, but we're looking at the whole basin itself. It's more of a big picture that we're looking at, or at least my group.
My name is Travis Friedman. I represent Desert Gold RV Park and Brenda RV Park. Considering everything we've just learned, my question may be more tailored towards the county. Why would we even entertain the idea of Heliogen setting up shop right down here on 42E with a hydrogen generation station, which was purported to use millions of gallons in their operation? And if we're at such a water deficit, can we just all agree now not to entertain any new high water consumption industries in our area?
Thanks, Travis. I don't represent the county. I'm hesitant to speak for it then, but I appreciate your comment. I had one more here and then I've got you, sir. All right. Your question was, or I should say, the comment from Travis was, can we agree? And I think you started saying I've directed to the county. Can we agree? No new high water use industry. And I can't speak for the county. I certainly can't speak for the community. All I can say is, as far as the department, I'll be right there to you. As far as the department's concerned, the tools that we do have in the toolbox are an active management area or an irrigation non-expansion area. They do not discriminate between high water use and low water use industry. It's different. We function within the framework that the legislature has seen fit to give us. So that would be the only response that I could give on behalf of the department. So I'll go here and then here and then you, ma'am.
Okay. I am on a small community well. We have 10 families on this well. We all contribute to the upkeep to it, everything. How is that kind of well going to be treated under this new program?
You said 10 folks on that well? 10 houses. Does that? So there are different ways that that wells will be looked at, right? If you fall under that exempt well status, then you would not be required to meter. There would not be conservation requirements that would be required by you. Now, we also require conservation and metering and other things for what are called municipal water providers, right? Those, there can be very large providers. City of Phoenix is a municipal water provider, and then smaller ones, significantly smaller ones. I don't know that that one would rise to the level of that, but I think it would make sense for us to, before I answer to your specific situation, to take a look at it. Happy to talk to you a little bit more offline to make sure we get you a good answer. I don't want to guess and then especially get it wrong. All right, my next question was right over here.
Thank you. My name's Dale Tyson. My question is, what's it going to cost and how long it's going to take to have a well grandfathered in? And then a follow-up is just if you could pull up slide that had the 40,000 acre feet that we've seen earlier.
The first question, how much will it cost to get a well grandfathered in? I'll just note that the grandfathered right pertains to the land, and I promise I'm not trying to be just a lawyer about this, but it is specific to the land. So what that would be is there would have to be an application process. There would be timing requirements. A person, if an AMA is established, a person who has land would have to require within a very specific time frame, and that would be set, you know, if an AMA is established. And then there would be an application fee associated. I forget, there was a change. I forget what the fee was. Yeah, yeah, $75. Yes, okay, I wanted to make sure. The application fee is capped at $75 for an IGFR. For each, I believe so, yes, for each IGFR. No. Per application. Multiple IG, got it, okay. I'm so glad I got folks here. So I should have gone right to you, Brandon, I'm sorry. Brandon, who knows, says that when you apply, you would tell them all of the land that you wish to be grandfathered in, and there would be a $75 application fee for that application. Now, it could be that you have an expansive operation, so there's a lot of land included. That $75 would encompass the entirety of your application. How long, Brandon, can you tell me how long an application would take?
There are statutory timelines that we have to adhere to. Some of those timelines, of course, there is an open application window that is typically, I believe, 18 months, a window to submit applications. And then after that deadline passes, there are other statutory deadlines and timeframes that we have to adhere to. So it ends up being close to about 24 months before we can award any sort of irrigation grandfather rights or water rights.
That's right. So there is, it can be quite a lengthy process to get that done. I do want to clarify for anybody here with an operation who's looking at that and says, I can't pause for 18 months. That's not required, right? However, we would require that that application be submitted so we can get that grandfathered. That's right. That's right. Okay. Yes, sir. I got you next. Before we move on, Supervisor Irwin has chimed in and would like to speak to your question earlier, Travis. If you could let them in, Dennis, or let Supervisor Irwin in.
Hi, can you hear me?
Yes, ma'am.
Okay, I just wanted to address the heliogen comment and concerns that were made. For the public's information, this application for this project was done on federal land on the BLM. And due to the concerns that were raised by residents, along with, I chimed in as well on concerns of the amount of water that was going to be used for this project. BLM did deny their application, so that project is no longer happening. And I can speak for myself, and the county is extremely concerned with any developments that do come in regarding large water use. We do want development, but we do want it in a responsible manner. So I just wanted to clarify that. And there was also comments that were made by ADWR submitted to the BLM as well regarding some of the information that was from your presentation today. So I hope that helps answer some of the concerns.
Thank you, Supervisor.
Sure.
My name's Andrew Hedinga, representing the Vicksburg Dairies. Quick question. If we did enact an AMA into this water basin, number one, how would the figures on the meters be utilized? What data does that contribute to? And then would that also potentially limit the pumping of the wells that are metered?
Thanks, Andrew. Your question is, if an AMA comes in, you got to start metering your wells. Does that mean that there's a potential limit? Yes, that's exactly what that means. You asked what that data would be used for. If an AMA is established and you apply for an irrigation grandfathered right and receive that right doesn't just say you can irrigate. But what it'll also do is it will designate the number of acres that can be irrigated and will provide an amount of water that can be applied to those acres. That amount of water is going to be based in part on your historic use, but also with conservation in mind, moving towards the most efficient and economical way that we can do this, allowing you to use that grandfathered right, but also driving towards water reductions where that's possible. So yes, there would be limits on that water. And those limits would be based on the amount of water. It's called a water duty that would be granted to each of those rights. I imagine you have a follow-up. Perhaps not. Well, if you think of one, let me know. But that's right. With an IGFR, with that irrigation grandfather right, come limitations. And those limitations would be, or in part, the metering that would be done to ensure that those limitations are met.
Just a quick follow-up. Tonight, we talked about the INA and the AMA is creating those districts and stuff like that. What's your thought about a BMA, about best management practices? Do you have to have an AMA to have that practice?
So I heard best management practices, often called BMPs. I also heard BMA. Basin Management Act, I think, was an idea that floated around in the legislature a while back and then went away. So perhaps that is out there too. That is not in the law. That is not a structure that would be something that would be available to us. Best management practices absolutely are or can be part of how an active management area is put into practice. Whether or not that is something that is used would depend on the goal that is set for an active management area and the management plan that is implemented for that area. Conservation is going to be required for water users, including ag, but not limited to ag. And that can be for municipal users or industrial users, and required best management practices can be part of that. Oh, okay. The question was, do you have to have an AMA to enforce that? Got it. I think the key word there is enforce. To enforce, as far as we're concerned, yes, right? We can't force you to use best management practices without the regulatory structure, right? And the only regulatory structure we have available for something like that would be in an active management area. See two over here. I'll go right here and then get you.
So on some of the data, I was just curious on collection. Was there any factors given on like that point that showed 1940 to today, 2022 or 2025, on new wells and well drawdown in the area versus like 1946, maybe wells were off that day. Just not refuting it, just questioning. I mean, that would have affected a lot.
Yeah, so like I said, when we do our index line measurements, we really try to find wells that are not near big pumping sources or too close to them where they are impacted by nearby pumping wells. We also don't do it within wells that do pump themselves. And we typically try to do it during off season. So for us, our field season is during the winter. So our guys will go out when hopefully most pumps are off. As we're trying to minimize the influence of any localized pumping. So you have to always know that or think about that when you're looking at data and say, okay, yes, that is 1940. There weren't a lot of wells nearby. This over here, it's dropping really fast. Well, the reason why is there's probably a well within 10 miles that wasn't there before that is pumping a lot, but that is the aquifer responding to that withdrawal of water. So we do capture that, we do want to record that, and we do want to see it. And like I was saying, we try to minimize any other influences, but we do try to do it over a long enough period of record so that we can say, hey, this has been 30 years, 40 years, 50 years where this is the trend. And it's not just some kind of fluky seasonal thing or something that's erroneous data. We want to make sure it's high value data.
I know there was some maps that were out there, like 2017 to comparing to report 18, I think was the number, showed some stable and some increases in some wells. Is there any kind of thoughts or explanations on what caused those?
You can absolutely have responses that are positive. So let's say there's an area where there was 10 wells within 10 square miles, and they were all pumping really, really hard, and we're monitoring that over time. And then you turn those wells off, and we come back a month later, 6 months later, we'll see the water levels responding because the way that groundwater flows is pretty slow compared to a lake. It's not like a lake. And so the aquifer response can take some time before it all comes back to natural static. So if you clip the time period that you're looking at short enough, you can say, hey, look, it's all coming up. Everything's positive. But if you look at the longer trend, the longer period of record, you go, yeah, it was going down. It's coming back up and now it's going down again. So we want to be able, we of course look at that. That's the temporal response. Is it too short of a window? Do we have enough long period of record? Do we have enough data? You always look for that whenever you're evaluating something. And like I said, we do try to cut as much of that stuff out of our responses. So the other part of that question too is who's doing the measuring and what wells are they? Because whatever maps you're referring to, if the 19 index wells that we have that are out in Ranegras right now, those are the ones that we use when we do those statistics and we do those publications, because we were the ones that collected the data during those periods where it's out of season. Like we're the ones that are minimizing all those responses so that we know, we feel good about the data being clean. But if someone else is doing their own like water level measurements and doing their own
The maps
analysis,
I'm referring to are ADWR maps.
okay, then yeah, if they're using our index wells and they're using our records, then yeah, you can have some fluctuation, but I haven't seen in any of the plots that we've been looking at, I haven't seen anything that suggests recovery.
Would the
or
increase
recharge.
show a healthier basin? I mean, that it has the capacity to recover?
Would it, I didn't catch the first part. Would it show?
Like if these smaller windows are showing that it does recover when wells are turned off season or in different, I mean, you can adjust data changing when you start and when you end. Does it show when on some of these, if it recovers when these wells are off, or it does show some increases to show a healthier
seasonal-
basin than projected?
Yeah, you see some seasonal recovery, but the long-term trend is still declining. So meaning when summer is over, the pumping is, and you've harvested everything, and you turn your pumps off, and you're gonna leave them off for a while. And if you come back and measure that well over the preceding weeks or months, you'll see the whole area will kind of buoy up a little bit some. But then the next season hits and it goes back down again. So that's why we always try to come at the same time per year to eliminate that fluctuation, because there's always seasonality. But that is at like a less than 1 year time period. We're looking at weeks or months, not multiple decades. But yeah, you can see that for sure.
Sorry, two more, I'll make it quick. An INA, AMA, just to clarify, does not prevent that water being moved out of this basin, or does it? Just for everybody here to understand an INA or an AMA effect on transferring or not being able to still stop transferring water out of the basin. Does it have any effect on it?
You said the ability to transfer water out of the. Gotcha. So, and I promise there's a reason I'm trying to be super specific. Do you mean pumping water out of the ground and moving it somewhere else, or putting it to use here and out of La Paz? Okay, so the question was, does an active management area or an irrigation non-expansion area stop the ability to pump groundwater and take that water out of La Paz County? Like to Phoenix? Thanks for saying the thing everyone was thinking. Can Phoenix steal your groundwater? Now, okay. Yeah, there are rules, and Emily's going to stop me if I say anything wrong. There are rules that say you can't do that, except in certain places, right? In the statute, they said that there are certain groundwater basins where you are able to take water out to move it into areas like Phoenix. This is not one of those basins. Yeah.
Care about the community. What's happening, what's gonna happen.
Sure.
But everyone here. So. Thinking still, something still happens outside of the farm county.
The question for anyone who couldn't hear was, okay, you can't do that now. Will an active management area or an irrigation non-expansion area stop that from ever happening? The way that something like that would happen would have to be at the legislature, right? That's not something that the department will be able to determine. It was the legislature who wrote in the law that you don't get to drain rural Arizona for Phoenix. And they said when they made that law, with a few exceptions, right? Harquahala is one of those exceptions. Butler Valley is one of those exceptions. Ranegras Plain is not, right? So to your question, we're not able to stop that. That's something done in Phoenix. The follow-up question was essentially ADWR doesn't control that. The INA or AMA doesn't control that. I believe that's a fair characterization. What I would note is that there are two ways, I guess, that you can take water out of a basin and send it somewhere, right? You can pump the water, or you can pump the water, do something with it, and then ship that thing out, right? And that is where an AMA or an INA does come into play, right? Whether you're producing hydrogen here and then shipping that hydrogen elsewhere, or just shipping water elsewhere. Those are sort of two different ways of exporting the water. An AMA would stop or could stop in many cases some new things from coming in. But it, like you said, whether or not water itself could be moved, that's a decision that the department's not making. Yes. Oh. You said if their community well is over 35 feet per minute and over 2 acres of community. So there's two things nested in there. I'm glad you said it the way that you did. So the question of whether a well is exempt or not is if it's over 35 feet per minute. You said 2 acres in the community. The reason that 2 acres matters is because we define irrigation as applying water to land for the production of plants or parts of plants for animal or human consumption, right? So that's where 2 acres comes into play. That's not going to be a piece that would come into play for whether or not someone has an exempt well. Whether your amount of land where your houses are greater or less than 2 acres is not going to be what we're asking. What we're going to be asking is whether it's over 35 feet per minute.
Ben, if we could just get real quickly to an online comment, if
yes.
that's okay.
And then
So this is from Misha Milejes. This is her comment. She says, I live south of Baus and are very grateful for the attention being given to the vulnerability of our aquifer. There are many industries currently hovering around our area because the land is very affordable and county regulations are less rigid than Maricopa. Our location is convenient between Phoenix and Southern California, Regulation of new water uses on an industrial level seems imperative for the survival of our aquifer. Strongly in favor.
Thank you for that comment. The next one was right here.
Mine's more of just what are our next steps? Because we didn't talk about next steps and where do we go from here? Who starts the process, who doesn't, who makes decisions? And yeah, where do we go from here?
Thank you. It is 6:15 nearly. Half the room is left. Before I go to next steps, you did have a comment, I believe.
I'm representing La Paz County, but Supervisor Irwin went ahead and answered the gentleman's question. But I do have a question. So you keep talking about, building this AMA together and how each county looks different. What do residents, what decisions do they get to make into this AMA? Can you give some examples?
Thank you. So the question gets to what kind of input does a community have on how the AMA looks? There are certain things that are set in stone and I should say set in statute. The legislature wouldn't agree that it's set in stone, but they're set in the law that we can't change. And then there's other things that are not. So for example, the way that irrigation grandfathered rights work, that stays the same. We know how that operates. However, one of the things that we would need community input for is for setting what's called the management goal. When you set the management goal, that's what drives all the conservation programs, and different active management areas have different goals, right? Some are prioritizing the economy that they have, right? Whereas others are prioritizing sort of a balance of inflows and outflows. And each one of them is going to be different, or many of them are different. What that goal would be here would be one of those things where we would need input from the community. The other way that this comes into play is in how conservation programs would look. For example, in the Douglas active management area, there were some questions about how to regulate municipal water systems when, I don't know if any of you know what it's like down in Douglas, it really does not look like Phoenix, right? And so the way that the department would interact with municipal water providers was going to be very different. And what they determined was that there were some ways that they could change that. Another way that they made some changes in Douglas was how they treated different size agricultural producers, where they had certain efficiency requirements that were more lax for very small producers because they had less of an ability to be as efficient as some very large producers who were able to handle higher efficiency with their economies of scale. So things like that are where we would need community input. Yes, sir.
Could you give an example where a property owner would be denied a grandfather permit?
An example where a property owner would be, well, I can give you an easy example. An easy example would be if the land hadn't been put into. So you're saying if it has historical use, but it would still be denied. If it has historical use, Emily pushed a button, so I'm going to let Emily answer.
So there are specific requirements in statute for how you, are entitled to a grandfathered right. And they're based on historical irrigation over the last 5-year period. So acres that were in irrigation during the subsequent 5-year period would generally qualify for the grandfathered right. So if there had been acres that weren't in irrigation, for example, during that 5-year period, those are acres that could not qualify. That wouldn't mean the entire property would not qualify, but it would be looked at on like an acre by acre basis.
Okay, so the next, yeah, I forgot to give you the guidelines. Sorry, everybody. So here are the next steps. I don't expect everyone's had a chance to say what they're thinking, or maybe hasn't put together what they're thinking, or maybe you'll have a great idea tonight. Most of my better ideas are after I'm talking to the person. So what we'd like is if you would be willing to send any follow-up comments, if you want to put your official comments in writing, if you had a different idea, send that to us. We have here an email, managementplans@azwater.gov. If you don't have a chance to write it down now, this will be online. It will be available to you. You can also fax at this number. I don't know if anyone's faxing anymore, but it's there if you want it. Until October 24th, 2025, we will want to be taking your comments. Now, if it's October 25th and you have another idea, we'll still take it, but we're trying to get as many comments as we can as soon as possible as we start to evaluate the health of this basin. So that's what we would ask, is that if you have additional comments, if you have additional questions, if you would provide those to us by that time. That is the entirety of our presentation, and you stayed for the whole thing. So thank you to all of you who did. Thank you, folks.